van Heukelom, and I'm the Chief Impact Officer at Socialsuite, and I'll be your host today for this webinar. Over the next 45 minutes, we'll dive into the future of sustainability, and we'll look at the key sustainability trends that will be, and some are already, shaping 2025. We have a global audience today joining us across many time zones to discover how business can stay ahead in this evolving sustainability landscape. And I know that a lot of you regularly join our monthly Socialsuite webinars, but for those that are new to Socialsuite, it's useful to give you a quick introduction of who we are and what we do. We're a sustainability technology company, and we develop software that helps companies reimagine, streamline, and embed their annual materiality assessment in their business. Our customers are around the globe, and they use our best practice software solutions to conduct impact materiality, financial materiality, and double materiality assessments. And we're really excited to have our European-focused CSRD double materiality platform launching very soon. So with that, we do a lot of webinars, and we have an archive on our website. So I would definitely recommend that you visit that and look at that. There's a lot of good information there, and we talk to a lot of sustainability experts that help us unpack topics, themes, and trends. So definitely have a look at that. Before I introduce our three speakers today, a little bit of housekeeping. There's a chat on the right-hand side here that you can use to ask our guests questions. And I would encourage you to do that throughout the webinar. So if you like, you can introduce yourself and say where you're joining from today. What we'll try to do with your questions is pick them up as we go, if they come in at the right moment in a conversation, but we'll have a designated Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. If we can't answer all questions, we'll make sure that we get back to you by email to answer your questions. This webinar is recorded, and it will also be made available on our website. So with that out of the way, it's a pleasure to have three well-respected and magnificent sustainability experts on our panel today. I'll do some quick introductions, and I'll start with, from my kind of left to right there, with Sydney. She's the founder and CEO of Bloom, an Auckland-based bespoke ESG advisory that assists investors and businesses in seizing opportunities where sustainability and value creation go hand in hand. Sydney has a strong track record of assisting European firms in advancing their ESG agendas, and she now aims to bring this expertise and experience and all the best practice that she's picked up to the Pacific. Welcome, Sydney. Next, we have Thierry. He is the founder and CEO of Climate and Decisions, a Sydney-based consulting firm dedicated to integrating ESG and climate considerations in every organizational decision. Thierry is a seasoned sustainability expert. He's a former Deloitte partner with over 20 years of experience in climate and sustainability. And he works closely with C-suite leaders to help their organizations navigate the complexities of climate and compliance while driving responsible and sustainable growth. So it's a pleasure to have you here as well, Thierry. And finally, then we have Nancy. She's the founder of North America's leading provider of sustainability and ESG disclosure services, the ISOS Group, which is now a division of Environ Energy, where she's the Vice President of Data and Reporting. To her work, she has directly contributed to the rise of the sustainability profession, providing training and advising experts since 2008. She's orchestrated hundreds of trainings, provided the market with thought leadership, and implemented projects for some of the world's biggest brands. So all in all, three more than qualified experts to discuss with us today the future of sustainability. So to do that, we've split up the focus today on four key areas. And of course, especially when you have people from around the world on the panel with a lot of experience and a lot of insight, we can't touch upon everything, but we've tried to thematically look at first geopolitical and investor dynamics. And there's a few key topics there that we want to talk about today. Second, we're going to talk about the regulatory landscape and pick out some key trends and some key things for this year to focus on. That will bring us then to integration and reporting, a key component to talk about, and a few other priorities that stand out, topical and other that are really important to just kind of touch upon as well. That's what we're going to do. Like I said, we'll split it up, those four areas, and we'll have a Q&A at the end. So with that, I'd love to get into that first area there about the geopolitical and investor dynamics. And what we've seen so far as we look ahead for the rest of this year, we already see the sustainability landscape really being shaped, yes, by regulations and technology, but there's also, and that is, I think, over the last year already become pretty clear that there's a real interplay of geopolitics and investor priorities here. So what that means is that we've seen just the impact of the US political climate on ESG. There's a growing demand as well from investors for reliable ESG data. So businesses are really now at that point where they're trying to navigate this complex web of influences, like what should I be doing? Should I be pulling back? Should I be doing more? How to approach that? But we also see that companies are stepping up to lead where governments fall short or are not doing what we hope them to do. So there's a lot happening in this space, and we see that sustainability is not merely that regulatory obligation, it's really becoming a business imperative. So with that in mind, I'd love to just start off with you, Nancy, and talk a little bit about what mostly is on a lot of people's minds. When we had a look about the trends for 25, the first thing that most people bring up is the US political climate. So I'd like to just start there and ask you what you've seen so far. We're about almost 2 months into this year. How is the current US political climate impacting sustainability, but also sustainable investment, ESG in general? And what have you seen, and how do you expect that businesses are responding to changes in the climate, to shifts, but given also that investors are still demanding this type of ESG information? What are your thoughts and impressions at this point?
I would say the world is very confused. This is the first time in the existence of our profession, I would say, where we're having to constantly pivot, maybe every 30 minutes. So not just the practitioners on the outside, but on the inside. And initiatives that are led by chief sustainability officers internally, they're kind of at a standstill because they don't know which way to turn. They had been working to prepare for our US SEC compliance for a while, and then now that's being held up or basically being torn apart. Now, also with the EU, we thought that would be our saving grace, and then there's the omnibus. So our multinational clients are also putting a pause on efforts. And then the state of California, which I reside in, also introduced some policies or regulations that were supposed to take effect in January. We're still waiting for guidance. However, in the last couple of days, I would say last couple of weeks, we've gotten news that the states of Colorado and New York are pushing for climate disclosure. So that's where I would say the hope is for movement in the United States. It's a huge territory, of course, a lot of companies, but those 3 states alone have the economic clout to hopefully to push things forward. Also with the investors, I'm hoping that they continue to press on despite the risk that they're facing. And then also, other key stakeholders like employees and supply chains that are really pushing things forward, because otherwise we don't really have a lot of momentum in our favor right now. So I guess I'll leave it at that. Yeah, sorry. I'd love to hear from the others too.
Yeah, so definitely like to see if yeah, Sydney, Thierry, if you have any views on this here, please jump in. But I think the key point, Nancy, what I heard there, which is I think that a lot of businesses are indeed like the constant shifting like you said, every 30 minutes, it becomes a bit paralyzing. Like, should I wait and just see what happens? So we've definitely heard that from companies that we talk to that say, well, we're just not sure what we're doing yet because we don't know what the actual direction is at the moment.
Exactly.
So what I'd like to link to that as well is we'll have to see over the next few months as well what's happening. But some businesses are definitely taking some leadership. We've already seen a few that said, well, regardless of the political climate and if regulations come through or not, we've been doing this for a long time. Like, these are mostly the multinationals that have their teams are reporting in place. They know what they're doing. They're just like, we're steaming ahead. This is fine. What can we learn from those type of businesses for maybe other businesses that are paralyzed? But also we've seen things, and this is a good example, potentially in 2017 when the US kind of pulled back out of the Paris Agreement. A lot of the business community came together under the kind of the banner of we're still in. we're still committed to this cause, decarbonization. So maybe Thierry, I'll jump to you there. What is your feeling, not maybe the US, but also generally speaking out about business leadership in this space around sustainability and the dynamics that you see?
Well, look, I think we are going through cycles, right? And there will be upward cycles and downward cycles. We are in a downward cycle right now. The good news is that there is a need for trust, and clearly investors and companies in the market need trust. And the only way to do that is to go through, transparency and providing ESG reporting, right? And so that is not going anywhere. Plus, there is a regulatory agenda that is still going ahead in Europe and across the globe. It's slowing down in the US. That's a challenge. But the momentum is there in Europe and everywhere else. Even though it might slow down, it may be simplified, but it doesn't matter. It's not going anywhere from my perspective.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point there. Is I think that sometimes these things are they're cycles, and sometimes it is a step or two steps back before you shift forward again. I do think like what we see in Europe, and we'll get to that when we talk about the regulation, the same thing's happening there. There are a few questions there, but if we look at the larger companies, if they're asked around, do you want to simplify the reporting? They're like, we've just figured it out. Keep it the way it is. We know what we're doing. We should be doing this anyway. So I think that business leadership is, let's just keep doing what we're doing and progress in this space. But you also brought up trust, and I think that's a key point there. Companies are quite, I think, there's a level of fear there if they keep changing what they're doing, because what investors in the end want is material data that's standardized and that's comparable. So if you keep changing what you're reporting, it doesn't become comparable anymore, and that's really a challenge to investors. So Sydney, from your perspective, what do you see happening around what companies can do to improve the reliability and transparency of their ESG impact and data to help build that investor trust?
Absolutely, yeah. And maybe just to that earlier point as well. So with this whole political buzz, it kind of goes back to why a business exists and what's part of its license to operate, and that's understanding your impacts, risks, and opportunities. And all the ESG frameworks actually channel that as well. So regardless of the political buzz, that's step one, going back to, okay, what are our impacts, risks, and opportunities? How that translates to data is also building your data around that framework. And there's heaps of great frameworks out there, regulatory driven or not. But the key to improve the trust in data is really around having a single source of truth. So what we see a lot of times is that data is fragmented across businesses, but it's very important to have one single source of truth, whether that's a platform where you have all your ESG data or an Excel sheet where you've just got all the ESG data points in there, which will also help third-party verification, streamline that process, and also reduce greenwashing risk if you just have that single source of truth. So I think that's really the key there.
Good points, and we'll definitely come back to two of them about assurance. That's something that's more and more in people's minds. And the other thing that we'll come back to is thinking about like what's important, the materiality, working that out. So you can't collect everything. And your point about frameworks, there are definitely some frameworks and standards and regulations. Which ones should we actually be reporting on? That's what a lot of people are figuring out at the moment. And I think that what that does is it does bring us a bit closer to that regulatory landscape. Because what we see is, yes, there are some questions and confusion around the geopolitics and the investor dynamics of what should we be doing. But we do see, and I think, Thierry, that's your point, that a lot of jurisdictions, bar a few, are just moving forward anyways. So there's a lot happening in that regulatory landscape. Nancy, you mentioned US states are now saying, well, if it's not happening at the federal level, we'll just do it. We see that in Europe, they've rolled out the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. There are a few questions, can we simplify that? But in the end, what you hear, there's already a lot of people saying, well, even if we streamline some of the the minor bits there, we're going to keep doing this. The Green Deal is still on there. So there's a lot of push for interoperable standards. So if I do one of these things, can I make sure that I don't have to repeat that? So I think your point, Sydney, is really good, that if you have one good data set of of material. You should be able to report quite easily to everything. So with that, you already flagged this, Nancy, but the US states kind of stepping up there. What do you expect how that will influence corporate strategies? And do you think that corporates are worried about different legislation from different states, or basically the kind of interoperability between different states and what they might put out? Or are states, from what you hear and see, trying to align that if one state's taking on particular climate legislation, if you do that, you tick the box for the other states as well? Is there any kind of coordination?
Yes, which is great. So I think you're alluding to some really good things there that, luckily these states that have picked up these regulations are some of our most progressive, right? And they do look to Europe as best practice or leaders in this space. So they're trying to model off of the European directives to try to create something that's manageable for companies operating within these states. So they're not just companies that are based there, but those that are operating. So very similar to the EU rules. In that, they're focusing more so on the climate disclosure. So the data and the risk and the management of those risks, which is great because we already have, and this came up as well, standards and frameworks that help guide us. So really, if a company is already using IFRS, S1, S2, or what was TCFD or what was SASB for their sector, then they're on track to meet those requirements. And I would say those that haven't done that just yet, again, there's best practice that's already been vetted, that's been introduced. There are models that we can follow in that. So I do foresee there'll be even more harmonization. I can imagine the states of like Washington, Oregon will also follow suit, and hopefully that'll help make it easier for the companies.
Yeah, good point. And I think this is something that a lot of people don't realize, that behind the scenes, there is already a lot of harmonization and interoperability happening between the major frameworks, but also the implementing jurisdictions, whether they be states in the US or the countries, jurisdictions that say, we're now at that point where no one wants to reinvent the wheel. Everyone is saying, if there's something good out there, let's use that and make sure that it aligns as closely as possible with existing frameworks. And I think that's what we've seen now as well, with what the ISSB has done with the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards. The latest, what I've heard, is there's 35 jurisdictions worldwide that are now committed to implementing that. So that's really still growing, that number of countries that say, great, there's a standard now, we can use that. But the question for some companies is still like, how do we kind of navigate some of the requirements? We see there's a lot of companies that, especially the larger ones, but even medium and smaller companies, that have traditionally been doing voluntary reporting. So that might have been using the Global Reporting Initiative, which is more focused on that, what are your impacts that you're having on the world? Whereas the ISSB standards are more coming from the risk and opportunity side. So you have that impact and risk and opportunity. Companies, we've seen are asking questions around that. If one thing's mandated, but I'm doing the other thing at the moment, where does that leave me? Thierry, do you have any views on that?
It's certainly a complicated regulatory landscape, and I think companies are a bit confused. They're a bit lost because it's changing every day. They have to comply to multiple regulatory requirements in multiple jurisdictions. Now, for global organizations who have operations in EU, CSRD is the way to go. It's the most sophisticated regulation out there. You have 1,000 plus regulatory requirements, compared to ISSB that is a bit lighter with about 200 plus regulatory requirements. So if you comply to CSRD, my view is that you will be fine with ISSB. There is no doubt about it. So if you can, CSRD is a benchmark. And even the concept of materiality or double materiality that is not in ISSB right now, should be the benchmark for all organizations to think about their material risk. Now, you have a risk view. I think you made a point, Tim, around risk versus value, and for me, you need to think of both. You need of course, to comply, and the risk lens is probably the way compliance has been lined up. But the reality is that businesses today need to make this a business imperative and embed that into their strategy. So yeah, that's my perspective.
Yeah, good points. I think a lot of companies are kind of working their way through that at the moment. And to your point, we do see now CSRD is the benchmark. Anyone looking at the most comprehensive, deep and rich reporting is CSRD. Now, Sydney, you've worked with some European companies on their sustainability reporting, on CSRD. There's a push now at the moment to simplify some of that reporting there. Is that, from your perspective, is that coming out of companies that said this is all too hard? Is it coming elsewhere? And what are the realistic problems that companies face that are trying to get started with CSRD at the moment? What are the main roadblocks that I actually kind of encounter?
Yeah, so the omnibus, let's just start with that. There's a lot of speculation around what that is and what it's not. Effectively, it's just a simplification package, which I also think addresses the challenges, which is one, the administrative burden. So they're really looking to reduce the number of data points that Thierry already alluded to earlier, being 1,000 plus at the moment, but they're looking to lower that down to 25% for large businesses, and I think about 35% for SMEs. That kind of showcases the challenge of the reporting exercise in itself, especially for small businesses, small to medium to large businesses, where this is quite a big exercise, and we've seen that working with our clients. The second thing which the omnibus will do is kind of simplify that implementation, really. So they're really looking to provide better guidance, sector-specific guidance, but also have a better Q&A section on various things that are, at this stage, are still quite unclear. So we spoke a little bit about double materiality. At this moment, it's still very vague what actually is required on, stakeholder engagement and those kind of matters. And that's a lot of discussions that we've been having with our clients is, what's best practice there and what does the regulation require from us. But these are things that at the moment are really big challenges for businesses because it's not clear in the regulation. So yeah, the good news is that that's coming up. The proposal, I think, is scheduled for next week, but I think it'll be pushed to March, knowing the pace of EU regulation.
Yeah, thanks for those insights. And yeah, indeed, we'll know hopefully in a week or at least in the next month or so what those simplifications could be and could look like and how that will impact businesses. And I think that the main message there, it is really aimed to unburden some of the smaller companies that need to face that reporting and that might not be ready for that. So we'll see what that brings. But regardless, CSRD is really it's there to stay. With that, then we get to that other question around if you need to do the work actually. So if you are reporting, if you are trying to integrate all that work, what are some of the key things that companies really kind of think about? And what we see that sometimes, it's not just about that compliance bit. It's really for companies about transforming reporting more into a strategic tool for value creation. And we've seen there's been a real focus started already over the last few years, but ongoing about supply chain, really getting transparency on that. And increasing pressure to demonstrate that there's accountability and what are the impacts across that supply chain. So on supply chain transparency, what have we seen so far? What the biggest challenges are really in achieving that end-to-end transparency? Companies are thinking about no longer what are my own operations, but really starting to look at upstream, downstream. So where do I get my inputs from and where are my products and services going? And then thinking about those relationships that I have, direct and indirect, and what influence do I have over them and how do I actually kind of map that out? And all that should really kind of influence like what the key impacts are and the risks and opportunities that arise across that full value chain. Thierry, what have you seen so far thinking about supply chains and where are people in that process? Is it really still a main challenge for companies?
It's a major challenge for companies. I think the roles of the company have changed, right? So we extended the role suddenly to include, you have now responsibility for your suppliers and your customers. It's a big shift because you never had to do that before. You just had to get products supplied, build your product, sell them to customers, but no one cared about how it was supplied, what was supplied, and how it was consumed at the end of the day. So it's really shifting the discussion. Now, as an organization, you are incentivized to actually go and chat, have a discussion with your suppliers, and you need to take a stance. You need to help them decarbonize. On the other hand, you need to rethink the way you are dealing with your customers, because it's no longer just a sales discussion. It's how they are consuming product. It's about how do you change the way you are building your product and services to make them sustainable for in the long run. So it's really a massive shift for companies.
And I think the one that companies often what we see is start with a supply chain. Like, where do I get my inputs from? And some of them are struggling with the downstream part of it. But I think we do see some initiatives and some things also consumer driven now with the kind of a movement for the right to repair. Where people say, well, I don't want to throw out my mobile phone or something. I want to just replace the battery or do something else. I want a company to enable me to do that. But also thinking about if people do throw out products, how do they do that? And what can we offer them in terms of that life cycle around the product, recycling, circular economy. So there's really, I think there's a lot of attention going to that circular economy in the coming years as well, about what can companies actually do to facilitate that. Now with that, then there's also a part about, and this jumps back a little bit about what companies are trying to achieve is really data quality and assurance. So once you're actually in that reporting process, but also in the actual doing, the practical side of sustainability, how do you track what you're doing? And how do you make sure that it's quality information that can be assured? So with that assurance process there, and we have the quality of the data and the process you're running through, I want to jump there to you, Nancy, and get your views. Like, you've been in this space a long time in terms of training people and thinking with companies about how do you actually, I guess, embed sustainability thinking in a business? How do you train mindsets and build a culture around this that people, starting to understand the importance of data quality and collecting the right information?
Yeah. So, when we first started with this whole process in the early days, we teamed up with GRI to become one of their first training partners, and the reason being that education was essential. So I see that again kind of coming to the forefront, especially with the supply chain partners. And given our unique situation right now in the United States, I think that's probably one of the critical things that larger, more mature companies on their journey can do, is to take that time not only to look more deeply at their data and make sure there are no gaps, maybe run some readiness assessments with third-party verifiers if they aren't already getting verification, but then help their suppliers do the same. So educating them constantly on what this is. We see this with some of the smaller, like, manufacturing firms that feed into these larger supply chains, where they don't even realize what these concepts are or why they're relevant, what they should be doing. So helping guide them through what matters most without getting too wonky into materiality, but getting them as far as we can on trying to streamline what's being asked of them through the different maybe customer questionnaires or other vehicles that are looking for this data of them. Firming up their policies. So revisiting, those are all things that they're very well familiar with, and that will constitute some data tracking measures to ensure that those things are being implemented accurately or to the best of their ability. Also, again, drilling deeper into their greenhouse gas accounting, given that that's pretty much a given that they're going to be asked of that data. So really trying to get them to think through where their major impacts are, what they're attributed to, where the source of information lies. And then in that, developing what we always try to push is an inventory management plan. I think oftentimes companies just jump straight to data, and they don't realize that if they go through this whole process of understanding how to manage that, what's being excluded, what's being included, what their calculation methodologies are, that really sets them up for success. And it takes some time, But I guess we can use this dark period as an opportunity to really firm up those processes, you know? So yeah, a mouthful, but I do think that learning is essential for that. And then just trying to strengthen the systems, the underlying systems that allow for disclosure and quality data.
Great. And I think I totally agree. And that's, I guess, one of the reasons we do these webinars is education, awareness. It's such an important tool to start that whole process. From your experience as well, in going through these with companies, what are your views on the companies have various reasons to get into the sustainability game? It might be investor demands, it might be regulation, it might be another reason there where they have to start reporting information. How have you seen those strategic shifts in businesses where it starts out as we have to do this because, and it then at some point moves beyond that to, hey, now that we're doing this, actually, we got strategy in place and we see there are innovation opportunities and we actually get to the point of value creation here. And if we hadn't started this whole thinking and this whole process, we wouldn't have realized that, or we wouldn't have reaped the positive impacts we're making or the other opportunities. So that strategic shift there, what are your views on that?
So to tell you the truth, I think that and this may sound radical, it's like an internal revolution that occurs, or evolution, because really, like as you just expressed it, there's a whole lot that goes on to discovering where the weak points are within the organization. And in that process, of course, you're engaging others and getting them on board with what this is. And eventually there comes a point in time where those that have taken this on assume more leadership positions, and that transforms the companies. So that's what we saw, like also in the early days, where maybe middle managers took this on as an add-on to their already busy schedule. They kind of led a coalition, and then eventually they've rolled into these senior management positions. I see that probably happening again. And that shift, like you said, it sparks innovation, it sparks efficiencies, it sparks these abilities to mitigate risk. All of these items are traditional business parameters that we use to assess the pulse or the health of our companies. And so at this time as well, I think maybe, at least for the US and where things are, I think that we need to kind of spin the sustainability dialogue to that position again, in order to lead with how we're managing really nimble, successful resource optimizing companies and creating value there, versus leading the conversation with our, our material topics per these standards, and maybe just use those as an endorser for what's being done. So again, there's an opportunity in how we kind of revolutionize these evolutionary points within companies right now. But I do think that strategy is essential to thinking through that.
Yeah, great insights there. And Thierry, I want to jump to you on the same topic. What have you seen throughout your experience working with companies? Are there any particular, there's never a silver bullet, but are there particular things that you've seen that really led to that revolution or that kind of eye-opening moment within a business where they suddenly get it, that you think they now get that there's value creation and opportunities rather than we have to do this?
Yeah, I wish I would see more of that, Tim, to be honest. I think Australia is very different, right? We have a new regulation, it's still pretty new. Group 1, so the biggest companies in Australia have to comply by 1st of January 2025. You are late if you haven't started. And the pressure is on regulation, right? No one is talking about value creation, or only a few leading organizations. But right now, the pressure is on getting ready. And it's not pretty because everything is done in Excel. And unfortunately, it's not strategic. They are just trying to get to a point where they're able to report. And it's hard because all of these sustainability teams, unfortunately, are all under scale and under pressure. And there is a lot of demand on them. And organizations haven't invested in building strong sustainability teams and capabilities. So it's lagging a little bit in Australia. In Europe, of course, you have leading organizations in that space, and it should be a bit of inspiration for all the Australian organizations for sure.
Yeah, good point. So yeah, what we see in Australia, indeed, a lot of companies are aware that something needs to happen, but they haven't really thought about what needs to happen in terms of resources, team, budgets, tools. All these things are now suddenly coming kind of top of mind, like, oh, what do we need to do? And that's, I think, the area that there's a lot of education required, and they just have to find their way through it with some help here and there, because it is definitely for companies that never touched this. It can be challenging. Now, with that, we get to the last area of defining priorities. So some of the things you already touched upon, but also a bit more topical, because what you do see when you start thinking about what is on the radar, what we see, climate is still front of mind for most people. It is the priority, but it's quite quickly followed now by biodiversity. And there's a real kind of thinking about that interconnectedness on those issues. We also see a lot kind of AI coming up about its dual role now. There's always been that discussion about the risk of AI. There's also another discussion about the energy use of AI, although apparently there are some breakthroughs there. But likewise, people saying, well, with AI, we can potentially solve a lot of climate, otherwise sustainability related problems. And then we touched upon the interoperability there. That is the thinking about how do all these regulations and frameworks and standards, how do they work together? And is there a way that we can just do one thing and we do everything? Now, we touched upon that. And if you do CSRD, you're probably going to tick a lot of boxes there. But also we've heard that CSRD is a mighty exercise there to undertake. There might be some kind of simplified versions of it for smaller businesses coming along soon. And then with that as well, over the last few weeks, we've seen that, and we touched upon this as well, that double materiality is really gaining traction there. It's both from organizations like the ISSB saying that, yes, at the moment we get companies to look at their financial materiality, but we want them also not to just look at risk and opportunities, but at impacts. And likewise, on the other side, we see the Global Reporting Initiative saying it's really important that we just bring these two things together. That's something that's already happened on the CSRD. So just some topical. So just want to kind of open the floor to the three of you. And then any thoughts on any of these topics, or is there anything else on the radar that you've noticed that is making its entrance this year that people should be aware of? Any thoughts? I'll jump to you first, Sydney. Is there anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, maybe on the discussion around frameworks and standards. So we've talked about, a lot of different regulations across the globe and the complexity that has for businesses. But I think it's also good to pause and reflect that we've actually come a very, very long way from where we were around 5 years ago. So, 5 years ago, we really had that so-called ESG alphabet soup with so many different frameworks and standards, businesses not knowing whether to adopt SASB, GRI, TCFD, TNFD. So that was really complex back then as well. And now, since 2023, we're very lucky to have, the ISSB standards providing at least that unification on climate, but also integrating SASB and GRI hopefully coming in there as well quite shortly. So yeah, just wanted to add there that we've come a long way, and I don't think we should forget that.
I think that's a really good point. Yeah, that it's always looking forward, but if we look where we've gotten so far, there's a lot that's happened. And just look 20 years back, where were we at that point? With beautiful annual reports with photos of communities and some token initiatives. And we're now really moving away from that to investor-grade non-financial information. That's a big move. Thierry, what are your views? Any further thoughts or insights?
I will pick the AI dual role question. I'm a big fan of AI. By the way, I've always been. I will always be. I think the world is shifting. There is no world without AI. Of course, we need to be careful with what we do with AI. It has to be AI for good. I think it will really help accelerate the journey of customers when it comes to implementing climate and sustainability regulations. So it should be something to consider 100% into every solution you buy, into everything you do. Now, of course, with that, there is a challenge of AI driving emissions. I think generative AI is growing. Currently, we are still at the pilot level, so we don't have a lot of scaled solution for companies, but it's coming. And when that will come, unfortunately, the emissions will blow up, and no one has planned for that. So think about your IT emissions when you consider your net zero pathway, because that will have a major impact. So just wanted to comment on that.
Good point. And I'll jump to you, Nancy, then. Any thoughts on any of these areas, or in addition, any insights?
Yeah, I would say on interoperability, that harmonization or alignment, I think, should occur not just at the standards or frameworks level, but also in terms of the questionnaires that a lot of companies are getting. And that requires some manual work and a lot of time and effort on the front end. But I do think that that's probably the best way to build out comprehensive data tracking mechanisms and disclosure that could meet the needs of all that's being asked of them. And then one other item here that I'd like to touch on, again, it's really critical for the US context. It's funny that I'm saying that, because normally I'm always speaking about the global context. So it's funny that now we're at this point, but is diversity, equity, and inclusion, because that's one that is really getting hit hard as well. And companies are fearful of how they speak about these issues, even though they're completely committed to the cause and to what it does in terms of generating value for their workforce and for the company at large. That one, I guess, I would share our recommendation is, again, kind of back to the previous slide, is focusing on what this does to generate value for the company, what risk it helps address, and then again have the activities kind of as justification. So those are just a few items that call my attention here.
Great. And I do want to kind of bring something important up there. So already to jump straight into the Q&A, because we did get some questions in there. I want to pick up on that point around DEI. And we've all heard that that's, the main thing, mostly in the US, on people's minds there. I got two questions in around DEI. There's one from Sarah that came in, and how do you address concerns from US lawyers? I've heard that some say they aren't sure that if sharing any demographic data at all on board and employees could be illegal, or they're nervous even to talk about inclusive corporate culture. So I think there's a lot of people are being scared at the moment, like, what can we do about anything in that space? What are your thoughts at the moment around that?
Yeah, everyone's fearful. Lawyers and the financial functions of the organization, well, general counsels, if they're internal or external, are all being brought into the mix now, and having to learn really quickly against an educational curve that many people have taken years to understand. And so I would say it is best to bring them into the conversation, but they probably need some additional consultation from experts in the field to understand the implications and what's being asked. What we may need to do, and I'm just speaking out loud here, is, without getting into the diversity metrics at like race or ethnicity at those levels, maybe just breaking it out by gender, so that then we can harmonize our metrics against our global operations, if it's a multinational, for instance, because there are jurisdictions that prohibit the data tracking of the race and ethnicity, for instance, or maybe other metrics of diversity. But that may be a helpful tool. And then also thinking about the international conventions, on the UN conventions on human rights, and remembering that despite what's going on in this country in particular, we still are part of a larger world, and there are guidelines for multinationals operating. So maybe that could supersede, or just keeping that as a helpful resource to refer to. So we have the UN Conventions of Human Rights, we have the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. I would say using those in harmony to kind of help chart the course forward is probably the best way, at least that we see at the moment.
Yeah, indeed, a complex area that's evolving, and a lot of companies are looking at, at what guidance is there to make sure I'm doing the right thing here, and what are my stakeholders expecting me to do as well. So it's definitely an interesting space. On that as well, I got a direct question from Jake. He asked, how might shifts in the US political climate, in particular DEI, affect efforts in other countries or jurisdictions, especially those that rely on US leadership or investment? So maybe that's a question for all of us there to think about. Have we seen any of that already kind of trickle down, those concerns that we have in the US, into either Australia or into Europe or elsewhere? Thierry, maybe I'll jump to you there. Have you seen any of that kind of outside of the US at the moment?
There are discussions, just we can feel the headwinds. There are concerns a little bit, but I haven't seen a big impact. I think the message is the regulation is not going anywhere. We all need to do it. We all need to be good corporate citizens as well. DEI is the way I think we are looking at it. What's happening in the US is probably it's not against DEI. I think it's more about winning federal contracts. So I don't think the DEI is challenged much, to be honest, from our perspective. But then, in Australia, it might slow down. I think it's used for political reasons. We see what happened with the elections here. Australians are getting inspired sometimes by what the US does, right or wrong. And so, we'll see what happens here. But right now, these are just headwinds.
Yeah, great. And then the final one, we're pretty much at time, but I did want to go back to one thing you raised, Nancy, and I think that's a key thing that we've seen is, if it's not the number one pain point for a lot of companies, it's definitely in the top 5, is all the investor questionnaires. So yes, whereas interoperability is coming, frameworks and standards are trying to work together to come up with one set. We're not there yet, but we heard from Sydney as well. There's been some great progress, but there's less progress from what we've seen is in a different set of ESG information. That's the investor demands and requests. I want to see this. And we hear from a lot of companies that is still all over the place, and they can still get inundated with different sets of information, often proprietary. Every investor creates its own version of it, sends it out throughout the year. Now, that's a key area that if anyone could pick that up and solve that in 2025, I think the whole business world will be very, very happy. Any final thoughts on that topic? Have we seen any efforts there that are exciting, or any thoughts from anyone?
I can jump in here. We work a lot with investors, and there's so many frameworks and standards within that space. We've got the UN PRI, we've got the ESG Data Convergence Initiative, the VC framework. So we still see that fragmented approach being held there. And what we've seen with the companies that we work with that are investor owned is really the key to go back to that materiality right, because that effectively also translates to the questions that investors are typically asking. So that's really the key there, I think, is really understand what is material for us as a business, how is that relevant for our investors, and use that to also answer the investor related questionnaires.
Yeah, and perhaps on this, I think it's a huge pain point, particularly for small sustainability teams. It's definitely complex. Then I think the sophisticated investors would have their own tools anyway, so I don't think they would use some of the ratings. So wouldn't pay for this information. Plus, some of this information is outdated. So realistically, there is a bit of a challenge there. And I agree with you, Tim. This is probably something that needs to be challenged in 2025. Yeah.
Great. So with that, then, I want to thank all 3 of you a lot, Sydney, Thierry, and Nancy. It's been a pleasure to talk to you about the future of sustainability and the trends shaping 2025. With that, I do want to end the webinar. If you'd like to watch the recording, please go to our website. You'll find our archive of webinars there. and thanks for your time.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.